Hi, everyone. In Romans Part 2, I want to talk with you about the narration and the proposition that we find in the letter to the Romans. We'll discuss the body of the letter and the closing in the next part. If, as many believe, Paul begins his narration, his narratio, in verse 13, then it's significant that even though many English Bibles do not divide the paragraph at this point, they probably should, since there's no conjunction at the beginning of verse 13, indicating, as no conjunction or a syndeton often indicates, there is a transition here. Paul begins his narration in verse 13 by saying there's something he wants those who read or hear his letter to know. As he says this, Paul addresses his readers or listeners as brothers and sisters. The word for brothers in Paul's letters is meant and properly translated to include both genders almost always. What Paul wants the Roman readers or listeners to know is that he has often intended to come to them in the past with a purpose. He's wanted to come and see them in order to, in his words, reap some harvest among you, as well as the rest of the Gentiles. The harvest of which Paul speaks expresses his hope that he will be able to preach or teach in such a way that some kind of benefit will accrue, both to the followers of Jesus at Rome and to the Gentiles who live in Rome and who have not yet heard the gospel. Paul says in verse 14 that he's under obligation to proclaim the gospel both to Greeks, which may be a reference to Greek-speaking Jews, or if not, to all of those who would be part of what today we call the Hellenistic or Greek-speaking cultural world. For while Latin was the language of Roman politics and law courts, Greek was the common language of the empire of Rome, which took over for the empire of Alexander the Great and his successors. And so the cultural world of the first century was primarily a Hellenistic world. Paul is under obligation, he says, to preach in that world and to minister the gospel also to barbarians. This is a pejorative word used by cultured Hellenistic Jews and Gentiles to indicate, for example, the people of Spain, who did not share the same Hellenistic culture. The obligation of which Paul speaks here probably looks back all the way to Paul's initial call and commission on the Damascus Road and its aftermath. Remember how after Paul's encounter with the risen Christ on the road to Damascus, Ananias is called to go and tell Paul, as the risen Christ says, and I'm quoting now, "He is my chosen instrument to carry my name before Gentiles and kings and the sons of Israel." Acts 9:15. And Paul says for this same reason, he's eager to preach the good news of the gospel to those who are in Rome. So in verses 13 and 14, Paul provides the narration explaining the circumstances that lead up to the writing of the letter in a very succinct way that reiterates what has been said both in the introduction and the prayer of thanksgiving and points toward the proposition of the letter, which we'll discuss next. The proposition of Romans. Verse 14 is the link between the narratio and the propositio. And the fact that they are connected with the conjunction for, F-O-R, means that in some sense, verse 14 can be considered part of both the proposition and the narration, a good, close link between the two. But the fact that verse 15 goes on to the subject of Paul's gospel probably means that at the heart of the proposition lies Paul's attempt to validate his identity and calling as an apostle in the eyes of the church at Rome, as well as describe for them the gospel that he preaches in such a way that the church at Rome will want to support his continuing missionary efforts. Those two things, Paul's validation as an apostle and the validation of the gospel he preaches, are, as we've seen, completely interrelated. They are mutually important. Each validates the other. As we've also seen already in our course, the value of honor and the negative value of dishonor or shame are primary social and cultural values in the first century. So when Paul says that he is I'm quoting now, not ashamed of the gospel that he preaches. Behind those words of Paul, no doubt, is the recognition that some at Rome may have heard from people who tried to shame Paul by pointing to what they considered defective deficiencies in the gospel that he preached. When Paul describes the gospel that he preaches, he does so in this way. First of all, the gospel, Romans says, is in and of itself the power of God. This is an important concept for Paul and for all those who preach the gospel who followed him right up to our age. Recall that Paul has already spoken in the introduction about the power of God, saying Jesus Christ has been designated Son of God in or with or by power. The resurrection of Christ manifested God's power, and in a similar way, the preaching of the gospel manifests God's power. For as the gospel is preached, God's power is released through the message, and the power of God's Spirit manifests itself, as both Jew and Gentile who hear the gospel experience its power and respond with faith and trust, and so become part of God's new creation. For just as God's Spirit hovered over the waters of the first creation, so God's Spirit hovers over the preaching of the gospel of Jesus' life and death and resurrection, and is able to bring the person, the woman, or the man who trusts its good news, the message of Jesus' life and death and resurrection. The Spirit is able to bring that person into a new life in Christ as part of God's new creation. Paul says in 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 17, if anyone is in Christ, that person is a new creation. The gospel for Paul is in and of itself the saving power that God uses through his Spirit to enable this to happen. And everyone and anyone who has faith, according to Paul, including Jews first and then Greeks. The reason the gospel has been invested with God's power to save and transform us so that we become part of God's new creation, which is invested like the risen Christ with life here and now and eternally. The reason for all of this is found in verse 17. For, Paul says, it is because the gospel is invested not only with power, but with the righteousness of God. Paul goes on to explain that the righteousness of God has to do with God's nature, which is full of right. God's character is full of right. That's what the word righteous means. The suffix in English, ous or eous, added to a noun means full of. So erroneous means full of error, or glorious means full of glory. In the same way, righteous means full of right. The preaching of the gospel enables those who trust its message to participate in God's righteous plan for salvation, to agree with it and the actions that led God through Christ to do what was necessary for any woman or any man to come into right relationship, first with God and then with each other. The righteousness of God and what he has done through Christ is revealed, Paul says, when we put our faith and trust in the truth that Jesus' life and death and resurrection can bring us into right relationship with God and with each other. When we put our faith in the gospel and God's righteousness and agree that what he has done for us through Christ is both powerful and right, and agree that what God promises still to do for us is right, then we become like Abraham, Paul says, who put his faith in God, in what God's righteousness could do for him. In the same way that Abraham participated in God's righteous plan for his life, so we participate in God's righteous plan for our lives when we heed the words of the gospel and put our faith in them. So the words that are written of Abraham become true for us as well, whether we are Jew or Greek or barbarian or American. Anyone who through faith accepts the righteousness of what God has done through Christ becomes rightly related to God, as Abraham was. And God's promise made to Abraham becomes a promise made also to us.